Mastering Revit can bring you more time, money, and happiness. It has for me, and it can for you. But it is also an unmarked journey. There is no well-trod path leading from being a beginner to an expert. It is instead a wild jungle full of difficulties that can easily lead to giving up. Hi, my name's Chris. I'm the Saturday Architect, and I have gone from being a beginner in the architecture industry, both with software and in the business in general, to running my own business successfully, depending on a masterful use of Revit. I'm going to first talk about the way we understand how to use Revit well. If you want to skip ahead to the tactics of actually how to use Revit well, the pieces you must have in your great Revit setup, skip ahead, check the chapter markers on this video, and you'll find where I talk about the pieces of a great Revit setup somewhere in the middle of the video. Let's talk about the end goal of how to use Revit phenomenally well. First, we have the mindset. One is knowing that ultimately we are using Revit for communication. Might seem weird. It's not a phone, it's not a video camera, but really when you think about it, we are providing information. First, we're compiling information in a Revit file, and then we're providing it to various different parties. We're giving them information about what will be built. And that means we're communicating. So keep in mind that clarity is paramount in how we approach using Revit. We also are creating a virtual model of what will become the real object, the real building. This means that there is a whole bunch of information stored in this model, just like there's information inherent in the various products and assemblies of a building. You have, for example, the height of a wall or the brand of a piece of drywall. You have the manufacturer of a light. You get the idea. There's data built into a building because we can look at something and know various different traits of that object. And the same goes for the modeled version of those things. And we can explicitly type those in to the Revit file. And then finally, how we use Revit is very important for making sure projects are profitable, so we do them at a good speed and they're high quality, and so that we can enjoy the process more, which is very important. By design, Revit is a front-loaded program. Building information one time before even starting a project, and then putting that information into a project whenever it's needed, that's how you use Revit well as an expert. Front loading also allows for increased speed in producing projects and going from start to finish. Once you've done a setup once before starting a project, that can be applied to different projects, and you are effectively moving where you start in a race, to use a metaphor of running around a track. Let's say you're doing a 1 lap, a 400-meter race, then you're effectively moving yourself from the 0 meter line all the way to some other meter line that is further ahead, the 100-meter line, let's just say. There are also, along with the mindset, benefits for you to reap. Going over such benefits in brief, there is performing better work. And this specifically means you're more accurately conveying what is going to be built, like I mentioned earlier about creating a virtual model of the real thing. And there also is an interactive trove of information for other people to use. Again, going back to the mindset, communicating is what we are doing ultimately. And so this trove of information allows us to communicate well if we've done the proper setup ahead of time. And then there is flexibility. Since there are always changes, being able to change the Revit file with as few obstacles and setbacks as possible is really an ideal goal. And this is possible to make it so that changes can be done lickety-split. But it does take understanding how to use the software as well as having done the proper work before starting the project. Then there's also faster decisions. And this results in clear visuals. So this allows people to make decisions based on what they can see better if you use Revit like an expert. Now that we've discussed the different mindsets and benefits of using a great Revit setup, let's actually see what the core pieces are of that great Revit setup. One of the most noticeable parts of this whole system is the Revit template file. It is going to set up for you most of what you'll use to work day in and day out in Revit. So here we are in Revit, and this is my template file that I've made. One thing to note about the template file is mainly over here on the project browser. Notice that I have a lot of views set up, and even within these collapsed portions, I've got various different views that I've already made of all sorts. So I've already populated this template file with many views, families, and just different things that Revit uses. I also have, if I collapse this, I'll go over here to families. I also have a bunch of different families loaded. And again, in each of these categories, I've got a lot of different families made. So this means that I have already done a lot of work. And that's really the way that you can see foremost that Revit is front-loaded by design. I'm not going to go into the details of the Revit template file in this video. I just want to show you briefly that having a template file with a lot of pieces loaded into it, settings, families, views, that is going to help you go through projects way faster than if you, for each project, bring in each of these pieces separately from somewhere else or make them from scratch. The next piece of this whole system is the Revit Library file. And I'll show you that again just briefly here. So first I'm going to open that file. I'll go here and open this. It's going to look similar to this, the first page anyway, with big red text, so I know what I'm opening. And I've just got a couple notes here for when I update it, which is a good idea to regularly update it. And again, it looks pretty similar according to the project browser. However, there is one big difference. This is not a template file. It is a .rvt file. That's not the big difference I'm talking about, but it is a good distinction to know. This is not meant to spawn new Revit files from. This is a repository for you to bring things from this file into your Revit project file that you're currently working on for each project as you need. This has a couple benefits. One, keeps everything in one place as far as families, views, view templates. I think those are really the big three that I have stored in here that I move from here to Revit project files. And it lightens the file size of the template and the resulting Revit project files. This allows for less lag time, really. That's the big benefit from reducing the file size. And there are other benefits too that I won't necessarily go into in this video. So here in this, I'll just briefly show you the significant parts of this. In the families section of the project browser, you can see here in the template file, I have several families loaded. In here, I have a lot more. Then we can go into, let's say, doors. This is pretty similar as the last one. And then we can also, let's say, go into maybe walls. I've got a lot of wall types in here for various different types of construction: wood, steel, concrete. You get the idea. So this makes going through the project browser in my project files a lot easier. It doesn't bloat the project browser. Here we are back in the Revit template file, the .rte file, the one that spawns new project files. One particular thing I have already set up in this template file took me a lot of time to set up, and it was tedious. It was very repetitive, and that is placeholder linked files. I'll go into detail about how to use those in a future video. For now, though, I'll at least show you what I mean in a menu and give a brief overview of their purpose and how they are so beneficial. I'm going to go into this floor plan view's view template and then go here to VG, which is Visibility Graphics, overrides Revit Links. I'll click on Edit, and then you can see here I have, 6 different files, linked files, loaded in. I also have each of these display settings set to custom. So I'm going to, once again, go into how to use these in a future video, but for now, the benefit is that each of these have already been set up and customized. So I have done the setup once, and now I don't need to do that again. I can load in each of these actual files that I received likely from a consultant, let's say a structural engineer or a mechanical engineer, and those view settings for one part of the VG menu, as an example, will already be applied to that linked file. The same settings applied to these placeholder files will now be applied to the linked file I'm actually going to use for the project I'm working on. That's the benefit, is it's just a huge time saver. Another crucial part of having a great Revit setup is having a pre-made shared parameters file. This is a separate file from your .rvt file. Revit uses this shared parameters file to read the properties of different parameters and apply those same parameters across many different files. This is in contrast to different classes, I'll say, of parameters, which are, for example, family parameters and project parameters. Those are specific and unique to each project that they live in, and that's the key there. They live in each file where they were made. They therefore cannot go from a project you are currently working on to another project you're working on because they are inherently embedded within that file. So keep that in mind. Shared parameters, if we think of like a tree graph, can be connected to many different project files, whereas project parameters, or family parameters for that matter, can only be held within that one file, and they cannot go from one file to another. They are unique. The final vital part of a great Revit setup is actually not in Revit itself. It's having a different platform that deals with how to use Revit so that employees and various people who use the software, who use Revit, are using it the same way. And so SOPs are what I'm talking about, standard operating procedures. I use Notion for this. Notion is a separate program, and you can see it down here on my taskbar. I'll go here. And this is a project management setup that I have made in Notion. Briefly here, this is a setup I've made for project management. It allows me to see the status and various aspects of my projects that are pieces of data that don't really belong in Revit and that are best left in a project management platform. And I've got a list of different databases here, and these hold different categories of information. This is really powerful. And again, I'll go into more detail about this in a future video. But suffice it to say, having a project management platform such as this is really crucial to using Revit well because you can have things like standard operating procedures, SOPs. There are platforms for these things outside of Revit. That's an overall description of how to use this platform along with Revit. I have this template available for purchase on the Notion Marketplace, and you are going to have so much time saved when you use this. This stores so much information all in one place in an easy to access format. Just as a brief overview here, I have included a way to look at each of your projects and keep various pieces of information there. There's a time clock and a whole host of different databases, which are just ways of storing different categories of information here for you to use. This is a great way to keep your employees and colleagues on the same page as you and everybody else working in a uniform manner, especially using Revit in a uniform way to keep it in the scope of this video. So look into this, and I have a link provided for this in the description below. We've talked about the core pieces of having a great Revit setup. There are three more aspects I want to bring up of additional ways to make an even more powerful setup. And the first one is having Dynamo files. I'm not going to discuss how to use Dynamo files here. That's outside of this video scope. But I do want to acknowledge that it exists, and it is a great thing to leverage for going through your projects even faster and in a more uniform way than without such a automated setup. Dynamo, in a sentence, is a way to perform a lot of actions in a uniform way very quickly. There is a learning curve to it, but it is definitely worth it. Part number two is a Keynotes file. That is something that some companies use and other companies don't. I don't use it. However, I can see good reasons to use it. I don't use it because mainly right now I am focusing on doing smaller projects, small residential projects, and these are not really conducive to having a Keynotes file. That's because the way that I see it, a Keynotes file is best for when you have a lot of different pieces of information that don't really belong in Revit, but you're going to reference directly in Revit itself. What I mean by that is something like specs or different categorized bits of information like master format or some sort of other similar way of identifying objects. A Keynotes file, from what I've found, is best used in large complex projects, mainly like hospitals or hotels, government buildings, schools, things like that, and not for small projects like single family homes or even maybe apartments. But I do want to mention it that it is a possible way to increase the uniformity and the speed and the overall power of your Revit system if you are working on complex projects. All right. Number three, I definitely use this one. It is the keyboard shortcuts file. Like the shared parameters file, this is a separate file stored outside of Revit. I believe it's a .txt file as well. This keeps information about how to use your keyboard shortcuts in Revit. I would go so far to say without keyboard shortcuts, Revit is unnecessarily cumbersome and way slower. That's because if you keep one hand on your mouse and you keep another hand on your keyboard, I use my left hand obviously because I am right-handed, then you can type in shortcuts for what you want, especially once you've memorized these shortcuts, which you will. Keyboard shortcuts make using Revit far faster than without using them. Just hands down. I don't see any legitimate argument otherwise. That's it for the list of core parts of your great Revit setup. I'll go over it once again. Let me look at my list. We have the Revit template file. We have the Revit library file. We have the placeholder link files, the shared parameters file, the standards platform, and the additional options that I mentioned at the end there. Those, when you put all those together, are going to work so well and make your use of Revit just insanely faster and higher quality and just more enjoyable. Your morale will go up. There you go. These are the core parts to understand and have set up before masterfully executing a project successfully in Revit. Each discipline has its own pieces to the puzzle to add as far as how to use Revit like an expert, but these core parts are the foundation to all those disciplines. What is one aspect of Revit you want to learn more about and have explained more? Let me know in the comments. Until next time, take care.